Ellis. I'm on the faculty here. I am very excited about today's speaker. A couple just announcements. Next week, come early and often because we'll have Eli Abranovich who will be talking about some interesting aspects of antennas. You'll want to tune in for that. And our whole series is online, so please look there for the full schedule. Also, the room is getting to some fire marshal will intervene. We are live streaming it in the hall, and so you can experience it out there, and there's snacks out there. So that's another incentive. With that, I want to get to our introduction of our speaker today, and to do that, I'm very excited to introduce Professor Ken Goldberg.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you and Eli for putting this great series on for us. So today's speaker is quite exceptional. When I think about his history, I think about the time when Great Britain in the 19th century shipped all of the rebels, all of the troublemakers, all of the people who challenged authority to Australia, and I believe that the statistic is 1 in 5 Australians have a direct connection to one of those early rebels. Now, let's flash forward to 1970 when our speaker moves to California, and he takes up residency at Stanford, that other school down there on the coast, and he starts working on computer vision in the early days of computer vision and robotics. He develops a system there called Acronym, one of the greatest names of a computer vision system ever. And he then goes. He spends time at Carnegie Mellon. He goes to MIT. At MIT, he also does something really interesting where he flips the conventional wisdom about robotic control, where he basically says we shouldn't keep state at all. That the world will keep the state for us, and the system should just be purely reactive. This has a huge effect. The subsumption architecture has a huge effect on robotics for the next decade. Then in the 80s, he founded the IJRR, the big robotics journal, International Journal of Robotics Research. He was IJCV. Okay, sorry, and also Lucid Lisp. He was involved in that. He founded or was co-founder of iRobot, if you remember, and built on the subsumption ideas to develop the world's best-selling robot, the Roomba. He was also starred in a movie, Errol Morris's Fast, Cheap, and Out of Control. And one of the quotes in there I love, which is, he said he had this great advice for how to do research. He said, find an assumption that everyone makes, and then flip it, negate it, and then see what happens. He then moved to. I remember that he did that actually in Pittsburgh at a conference I was at, where he basically stood up and he said, we should really be working on humanoids. And I remember doing a double take, like, what? And by the end of the conference, he had convinced most of the people that we should be working on humanoids. And in fact, Asimo and Atlas and all that grew out of that initial statement that Rodney made. He went on to become the director of CSAIL at MIT. He then left that to form Rethink, and another radical rebel idea, which was that robots should be collaborative, should be human compatible and safe. That had a huge impact. And then in 2018, he basically has started another company, or actually just this year started another company, and now he's basically attacking the latest sacred cow, which is artificial intelligence in general, and the idea of superintelligence. So I like to think of him as a rebel, always with a cause, and I think of him as the Marlon Brando of robotics. Please welcome Rodney Brooks.
That on? Yeah, for the streaming. Is that on?
Yeah.
Okay. I'll put it up closer. Yeah. Okay. Well, thanks everyone for coming. A lot of you here. Thanks, Ken, for that introduction. So I'm going to talk today. It's really a talk in two pieces, and some of you, Jitendra, has heard the first piece in a much longer version, and that's the steps toward superintelligence. And then the second half is something I have never talked about before. It's all brand new, so it may annoy some people, and you may want to throw things at me. It's good. It's fine. So, we've been talking about artificial intelligence for a long time, since 1956. Sometime in the 80s or 90s, someone decided, oh, well, I'm going to I'm going to show the world. I'll talk about artificial general intelligence. But AI researchers really wanted general intelligence all along, so it's a bit of a marketing ploy, artificial general intelligence. And then more recently, people have gotten a little scared about artificial superintelligence, where the intelligent robots are going to be so smart, they're going to turn us into paper clips, or they're going to take over the world or something. I don't exactly know. So I do want to talk about that today. This is a study that Nick Bostrom and another gentleman did around 2013. And this was the percent likelihood of a bunch of people they surveyed about when superintelligence will come, when something that's so much smarter than humans that we will have no recourse against it, just take over the world. And the 50% likelihood was 2040. The median pessimistic year was 2075. And they come up with this prediction, which the press has widely reported, that we'll have artificial general intelligence, human-level intelligence by 2040, and superintelligence by 2060. And you know, I don't buy it. I think it's going to be a lot longer than that. And so my predictions are more like maybe 2300 for AGI, maybe 2400, but I may be off by a few hundred years, maybe a while longer. So there's sort of a danger that I'm sort of this grumpy old guy saying, you young people, you'll never do it. You'll never do it. So I don't want to be that grumpy old guy. It's just a natural state as you get older. So I want to try and be constructive today. In the first half of the talk, I want to be constructive about how we could get towards superintelligence, what you all could work on and do well at and have good careers working on within the current framework. And then the second half of the talk, I'll talk about what you should do if you really want to have an impact on the world, but don't care whether you'll get tenure or not. So this first half, you can get tenure. So Marvin Minsky wrote this paper in 1961, Steps Toward Artificial Intelligence. It was a great paper. It had a couple hundred references in 1961 about AI, 5 years after the Dartmouth conference. It was very influential. It broke AI down into 5 areas: search, pattern recognition, learning, planning, and induction. And really 3 of those 5 were search. That was the key idea then. And so it was a sort of influential paper. So this talk is my version of it, Steps Towards Superintelligence, and that's the first half of this talk. So I'm just going to go over 5 topics about this. I'm going to start with a brief history of AI. Alan Turing, you've heard of him, 1936 on computable numbers, 1950 computing machinery and intelligence. But in 1948, he wrote a paper called Intelligent Machinery, and his lab head forbade it to be published. That was Sir Charles Darwin, grandson of the other Charles Darwin, thought it was too flaky. So it didn't get published till 1970. It was a great paper, actually, in 1948. This is the start of it. The possible ways in which machinery might be made to show intelligent behavior are discussed. It's AI. The analogy with the human brain is used as a guiding principle. So this is 1948. He's trying to build intelligent machines, and he wants to use the human brain as a guiding principle. We shall be concerned with discrete controlling machinery. And by discrete controlling machinery, he means machines that, and an abstraction at least, change state instantaneously from one state to another, which is what digital computers do. And he says brains very nearly fall into this class. I have trouble with that. McCulloch and Pitts, 1943, had started to convince the world that this was true, but I'm not so sure. I don't know, Bob, if you agree that brains are... No? No? Okay, good. Thanks, Bob. For those who don't know, Bob studies animals and how they operate. In his 1950 paper, he starts with the imitation game, which we all now know as the Turing test. I propose to consider, and he wanted to consider the question, can machines think? And this was the topic of this paper, and he talks about it. He says, the reader will have anticipated that I have no very convincing arguments of a positive nature to support my views. But this is the 1950 paper, and people sort of read it, and this is the way it is, this is the way it is. And now people, he figured it all out in 1950, but he didn't have a good argument for much of it. Here, who knows what ESP is? Put up your hand if you know what ESP is. Yeah, I normally see a bifurcation between older people and younger people. Older people know that ESP, extrasensory perception, was considered a thing back in the 60s, and younger people have never heard of it. But he thought ESP was part of the world. It was just, ESP's there. So he considers can machines think, and he says, this is the middle there, I believe that in about 50 years' time it will be possible to program computers with a storage capacity of about 10 to the 9th. He means bits, if you read it carefully. He does mean binary bits. 10 to the 9th bits, which is 100 megabytes, to make them play the imitation game. The imitation game is the Turing test. And the reading here, you have to be careful. He's actually saying only 30%. The imitation game will only succeed in fooling people 30% of the time. But he says in 50 years, this is in 1950, so we're talking 20 years ago, chance of making the right identification after talking to whether it's a computer or a person. Is it a computer? Is it a person? And that's a program with 10 to the 9th bits. Where did he get 10 to the 9th? Why does he think that? Well, he says he'd be surprised if more than 10 to the 9th bits were required, because the capacity of the Encyclopedia Britannica is 2 by 10 to the 9th bits. So somehow he's going to move in a second towards programming, although this is declarative knowledge, in the 11th edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica. I actually have a copy of the 11th edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, and the text I estimate is 1.6 by 10 to the 9th bits, but then there's some diagrams, so he's pretty right. But 2 by 10 to the 9th bits, he thinks about half that as a program will be sufficient for intelligent machines, running at the speeds of 1950 computers. That's his estimate. In yellow down there, I produce about 1,000 digits of program a day. That was before assemblers or before computer languages, so he programmed in binary, so about 1,000 binary digits a day. And he estimates that 60 workers working steadily through 50 years might accomplish the job, get to that 10 to the 9th bits. If you do the calculation, they get every second Sunday off. But that's a minuscule amount of effort. The EECS department at Berkeley has had way more, many times that amount of effort on AI already, just here. Have we got full human level intelligence yet? Not quite. So he actually says we should use learning. So for all of you here who do learning, this is the happy message. Just learn it. By 1956, this was written in 1955, the proposal for the famous summer workshop. The first few pages were written by John McCarthy. The conjecture that every aspect of learning or other feature of intelligence can be, in principle, be so precisely described that a machine can be made to simulate it. So it was just an assumption here. We can make machines do AI. And he thinks that we may have to speed up the computers a little bit, but the major obstacle is not lack of machine capacity. Some of them had 100 kilobytes back then. But our inability to write programs to take full advantage. So everyone thought it was going to be way easier than it turned out to be. And I'm just going to outline very briefly and give little cartoons of what I see as the 4 approaches that we've had to artificial intelligence over the since 1956. Start with symbolic, which was John McCarthy's approach, which is, first order logic, writing everything down. Jitendra Malik used to be McCarthy's student doing this for a while in his earlier life. And that's been an area that people have worked on for a long time. It has some problems. Underneath it all, the symbols are not really grounded in the world. They're just arbitrary symbols. But that's got good compositional properties. Second approach is neural networks. Neural networks were first discussed in 1943. Marvin Minsky's early 1950s PhD was neural networks. And recently we've seen just a spectacular explosion of neural networks where we went from conventional neural networks to deep learning, where we got rid of the feature detectors at the start. We replaced Jitendra as the first stage, and suddenly it worked a lot better. as Jitendra tells the story of Hinton calling him up and badgering him about it. And the big thing that this really struck home was in 2014 when this picture appeared in the New York Times, John Markoff's story, and a Google program had labeled this a group of young people playing a game of Frisbee. Astonishing to everyone that it could come up with that. And other sorts of machine learning, reinforcement learning, have been around for a long time too. Donald Mickey, 1961, reinforcement learning. You add on Chris Watkins, 1989, Q-learning PhD thesis, and you have DeepMind, playing games. You're supposed to laugh, but okay. That's the second approach. Third approach, conventional robotics. Larry Roberts in 1963 at MIT Lincoln Labs processed this image. You might think, wow, he only processed one image? Yeah, he only processed one image. That was 1963. In 1981, my PhD on computer vision, I processed 3 images. We were really moving by 81. But in 1963, he processed one image of this block and figured out that it was a block, and that gave license to AI to work in the blocks world. Then people started doing PhDs on how to interpret these sorts of line drawings. I believe Jitendra Malik may have done such a thesis. That's the last time I'll pick on you. I'll move on. But blocks world became a domain where you could do AI. You didn't have to do the vision part anymore because we knew it could be done because it had been done on that image, and from line drawings. And so people actually did do blocks world vision. This, unfortunately, I can only get very blurry images from 8mm film from the 60s, the copy demo at MIT where blocks were picked up by robots and moved around. And then famously, the shaky robot down at SRI International in Menlo Park, a big robot, about this big, running around in a fake blocks world with blocks where every surface of every block is a matte surface so you can see it. It can do some visual processing. So that's traditional robotics. In 1950, Walter Gray was his given name that he went by, an American in Bristol, started talking about his little tortoises. He called those robots, that robot like the one on the left, a tortoise because of what it taught us. It used vacuum tubes as the controller. It was pre-digital, but he made just beautiful use of the nonlinear dynamics of vacuum tubes, especially as the battery voltage changed over time. And in 1950, was this 50 or 49? Oh, this was 50. In 1950, he published his first paper in Scientific American showing all the behaviors these tortoises could have. There was one the next year, another paper showing with learning, etc. In the mid-'80s, I sort of turned that into a digital version with what I called subsumption architecture, later called behavior-based approach. I had lots of boxes and little arrows, so I managed to get the paper published in the second issue of Neural Computation, even though it wasn't neural at all. And that led to the Mars rovers. Sojourner, the first 28 sols was under teleop. Between sol 28 and sol 84, it was using a behavior-based approach. You can see it off there in the distance, wandering around. And so the first rover on Mars used this approach, turned into the Roomba, as we heard about. And more recently, after Damien Isler in 2000, fixed it a bit and made it a lot better, turned into behavior trees. So Unity and Unreal, the two big engines that drive well over 2/3 of the video games in the world, use these behavior systems. So behavior approach has driven the largest number of robots that have their own long-term existence in the world, are not teleoped in any way, and drives all the AI characters in video games. When people talk about putting AI in video games, it's with this technology of behavior trees. So this is my cartoon version of those 4 approaches and how to tell them. Symbolic and robotics are sort of deliberative. Behavior has some reactive and deliberative, and neural, I see a cat. And here I've tried to say how well the 4 approaches do it 5 different things. I said symbolic approaches could compose stuff together well. It's harder to get neural pieces to compose together well, or behavior pieces. But the symbols are the glue that let things compose. So I gave them a 3. I gave some others 1s and 2s. Grounding, we always complained that traditional logic AI wasn't grounded in the world. From one point of view, neural approaches, deep learning, do provide symbols, and we have ontologies that we can look them up in, so they are in some sense grounded, but they're not quite grounded in action. So they're sort of a bit loose. Spatial, sentience, ambiguity, etc. So I just compared these, and then just for fun, and this is really scientific, scale of 1 to 3, I decided to compare how they did on cognition and then compare them to a human child. And these are the numbers that popped out. We're just so far away from human level performance. We're so far away from apparently squirrel level performance. I just heard a story about what squirrels do and how they're beating Berkeley undergraduates, you were telling me, on food caching tasks. Child squirrels. Child squirrels. And none of our current approaches are at all like cognition when we talk about cognition. None of our AI systems are cognition. So that's where we are. But nevertheless, people have predicted that we're just on the verge of great things. And why are people so bad at predicting the future of AI? I had an article in the MIT Technology Review a year or so ago, on what I called the 7 deadly sins of predicting the future of AI and why people make mistakes. I'm not going to go through the 7. I'll just talk about 2 very briefly today. The first one is performance versus competence. We know when we see a competence of a union, when we see performance of a human, we're able to generalize to what sort of competence they have in that general area. And that generalization does not work with these AI systems. So if we see a system, or if a person looks at this and says a group of young people playing a game of Frisbee, you'd think that that person would know a lot about Frisbees, like, can you eat a Frisbee? What's the shape of a Frisbee? How far roughly can a person throw a Frisbee? All these sorts of questions. A person who sees that and they're playing Frisbee, they would sort of know these things. They wouldn't have to, list them. You can ask them the question, they'd be able to give the answers. Can a 3-month-old play Frisbee? And it would be weird if the person couldn't answer them. But the labeling systems don't know any of these concepts at all. So it's a very different sort of thing. So we see a person performing at some level, we understand what sort of competence they have. The press or other people, maybe tech tycoons who make electric cars, see performance of an AI system and generalize to a competence which it doesn't have. So that's the first sin. And we've seen, what are these called? Antagonistic?
Adversarial example.
What?
Adversarial.
Adversarial, that's the word. Yeah, so here, this was back in 2015. Guitar, Penguin, 99.9% labeling, and then using a thing from Artificial Life, hill climbing and evolutionary algorithms, Carl Sims' original stuff, Anita, you might remember, generates that, by searching, the same thing that says that's a guitar, says that's a guitar, and that's a penguin. See the penguin? And lots of adversarial examples. That's the real one, but it thinks that's a baseball. You can sort of see why. It's matchsticky, but it's not a matchstick. And then there's natural ones that things get wrong. Why does it say that's a snowplow? This is just an image. Why is it a snowplow? Well, you can sort of see. We as humans can reason about it. It's an orange thing, the snow, it's across a road, but we also see, oh, that's a person in front. We get the scale, we see the other things, it's a school bus. So that's one of the reasons people get it wrong. They don't think it's more general than it really is. The second thing is suitcase words. Marvin Minsky used this term, suitcase words. A lot of things that happen in AI, we use words like this. A program can beat a human at some task, it can describe, can estimate. But these words in English have a lot of meaning to them. So let's take learn. When someone here at Berkeley has a new paper about learning and the Berkeley press office says such and such's paper now learns to do some task, people out in the world hear learning and think of all sorts of things about learning, and it may be very narrow. Here's real learning. You can learn to play tennis. Very different, well, sort of the same, but a little different from learning to ride a bicycle. That's quite different from learning Latin. Different sort of learning. Total, just because you have a machine which learns to ride a bicycle, it's unlikely it's going to learn Latin, which is again different from learning algebra, even though they both use blackboards. Different from learning chess. By the way, I can read Latin, I can do algebra. I've tried, I can't learn to play chess. It's a different sort of learning. Learning to play an instrument, learning your way around a new city, learning the code. They're all very different sorts of learning, but those suitcase words lump too much stuff together. So I think that's why people incorrectly estimate how far along we are with artificial intelligence. Now, how are we going to fix that? First, I think we need to agree on some metrics. And the current metrics that we have are the sort of the Turing test, which was, can it talk to this thing and decide whether it's a human or not? And Turing's he called it the imitation game. He did not call it Turing's test, but we call it Turing's test. If you read his paper, is it a rhetorical device he's doing? He starts with a man versus a woman. Can a woman and a man fool a human by saying words to them over a teletype or instant messaging interface? And I think Anita Flynn ran a competition on this at the MIT Artificial Intelligence Lab in the early 90s. And there was this surefire question that some people came up with that could tell whether it was a man or woman they were talking to. They'd ask, remember the little green soldiers you had when you were a kid? This is, with an instant messaging. You remember this example? Sorry? G.I. Joes. You remember those? How did you play with them? Okay, so if it's a woman on the other end trying to convince you it's a man, she says, I lined them up in rows, I had them, fighting each other, blah, blah, blah. And if it's an actual man, he says, I stomped on them, I burnt them, I did kick them. So when the person got that, then they were able to tell the man and woman every time. But that's an aside, sorry. If a machine replaces one of the people, can the machine fool the person? This is the Turing test. Then, and this is Turing's rhetorical point in this paper, if you can't tell whether it's a person or a machine, and we know that people can think, well, then why can't we say the machine is thinking? Why can we say the machine is not thinking if it can do just as well as a human? That was his point here. And it's hard to tell whether he thought it was a thought experiment or a real test. But in other parts of the paper, as we saw earlier, the 10 to the 9th bits, he talks about how to construct a program for that. I think 3,000 person years is possible to do it, but way too onerous, suggests having to learn. So in some ways he treats it as a real test. But what we have seen over the last 20 years is people using chatbots, and they're just hacking the test. It doesn't tell us anything. So what's a real test about whether we're getting intelligence from our programs? Intelligence in the human-like way. I think we need some different sort of test. Now, if AGI, artificial general intelligence, or superintelligence, really were human level, or really were super level, it better be the case that they can do whatever people can do. Now, there may be an outlier that they can't beat at something, but if 1 billion people can do some task and your AI program can't do it, I don't think that counts as being human level. With 2 billion people, whatever. So what are some things that lots of people can do that we could test against and see how well it was doing? And here's just a couple of examples. I do not expect anyone to adopt these examples, but I think we need, as a field, to replace our tests and what they are, because they're not adequate right now, relying on the Turing test to say, yeah, it's intelligent. And I chose two, an elder care worker and a services logistics planner. And an elder care worker, if it was a robot, or a person. It's a live-in care provider for an elderly person over decades as they get older. It's got to be able to understand human relationships and expectations in the household. It's got to provide physical help to the person, including whole body manipulation. It's got to understand how their language degrades. So, you know, you can talk to Alexa and you have to give well-formed questions, but as someone gets older, it's like, no, the thing over there. Alexa's not going to do that for you right now. It's got to understand and provide for human needs. What else? Oh, it's got to balance, and Alexa doesn't do this, and none of the systems, balance the needs of the person with being annoying to the person, for instance. Now, a service logistics provider has got to be someone, you know, with no prior knowledge. You can request them to do some logistics thing. And this is, my model for this is an Army colonel. Army colonels regularly get a new assignment, especially in some intervention somewhere. You know, set up a dialysis ward, set up an airfield. They don't know how to do it. They got to go figure it out. They got to do everything. So our AGI or a superintelligence should be able to do it. It's got to be able to do geometric reasoning, including perhaps meeting standards, do quantitative physical simulation, understand human needs and fears. It's got to understand human psychology if they're, you know, setting up something for them. There's a whole bunch of things that they need to be aware of. This is nothing like anything that our AI systems can do today. You could build a special purpose one that could do some of this, but a general purpose one where you can assign it any of these tasks. So, elder care worker, there's going to be a lot of pull for this as we get older, the demographic inversion around the world. This is what it looks like if you Google elder care. For those of you who've had relatives in elder care, you know it ain't anywhere near this pretty. It's not pretty. But, you know, providing physical help, getting them into and out of bed, doing things that they can't do as they degrade over time, and figuring out how to do that in a meaningful way, figure out how to interact with other service providers, family, etc. Big challenge. We can't do anything like this at the moment. And if you're going to have AGI or superintelligence, it better be able to do at least this, because billions of people do this with no training. We can just do it. Humans can do this. The services logistics planner, my model here, as I said, is an Army colonel. Army colonels get assigned, go do this task, go build this thing, and they go and do it. And they have to understand local customs, they have to understand the whole workflow. This is dialysis, for instance. They have to understand how they're going to plan the space, where the patient's going to be, where the relatives are going to be, how it interfaces to public transportation, et cetera, et cetera. Vastly more complex than anything any AI system can do. So we're just a long way away from it. And these are sorts of real tests. Now, what's hard today? What are some of the things? Let's try and make it more concrete. First, what are hard things? What we should work on. So, in my blog, rodneybrooks.com/blog, I've got a whole bunch of them, sort of random. I'm just going to talk briefly about 3 of them today. Real perception. Real perception. We saw those adversarial things, you know, the things label these as a lesser panda and an armadillo and a baseball, etc. But here's a real one. This is from a Senate hearing last year in DC, where a vision system for an autonomous vehicle, you put these pieces of tape on the stop sign and it says it's a 45 mile per hour speed limit sign. That's a bad mistake. That's a really bad mistake. And people say, well, more data, more training. You know, it's always the answer. More data, more training. But let's just, stop signs are red. 45, you know, speed limit signs are white. How could it possibly make that mistake? Well, it turned out Jitendra was useful. In you know, figuring out what the right features were. If you just have your labels and your data set, all you get out is what's in the data set and the label when the thing automatically does the feature extraction. And no one who does computer vision is allowed to answer the following questions. If you know anything about computer vision, you are not allowed to say anything, okay? So what is this a picture of? Someone who knows nothing about, is there anyone here? No, you all know something about computer. What is this? It's a checkerboard. How do we know it's a checkerboard? Well, it's alternating black and white squares, right? Yeah, except one's black, one's white, except they're the same color value on the screen. And you can't see that when you see the whole thing, but if you start covering stuff up, they're exactly the same color value. Our brain handles different lighting conditions, and we see this and casting a shadow, and we compensate for that. So we get the constancy of light versus dark, even though the lighting conditions are different, which you may not get from just labeling and having labeled images. And there's the 2 pixels from, I just picked the pixels right there and expanded them there. What about redness? What is that? Strawberries. How do we know the strawberries? Well, they're these red lumpy things, in the image. There are 750,000 pixels there. There's only 122 pixels where the redness is more than both the blue and the green. They're the 3 pixels with the highest redness, where it's more than both blue and green. Here's the 3 pixels where with the biggest R. But we infer redness because we're using top-down processes and bottom-up processes. Oh, that one's a bit red. Not when you get rid of the picture. Can you see that? For some people, it comes back red versus not red, as these appear next to it, because it sort of bleeds over. So that's called color constancy. If your image labeling system is not teaching about color constancy, it doesn't just pop out. We did learn it. We animals learn it evolutionarily over time. It was a long learning process, if you count evolution as learning, but it's not necessarily going to come from a small data set and having the right labels. So working on real perception, which works in real situations, as distinct from what we see in many papers, is hard. Real manipulation, and I know some people here are working on interesting manipulators, but I just want to show you one example. This is the hand-eye group at Stanford in 1978. This is called the blue arm, and over here is the gold arm. You might wonder, how do I know it's not in the picture? Well, that's me. I was there. So the gold arm. If you go into Margaret Jacks Hall on the Stanford campus today, you'll see the gold arm. It's sitting there, and look at its gripper. It's a parallel jaw gripper, and just slides these 2 fingers back and forth. 1978. Here's what my company sold in 2018. You notice that's how many years is that? 40 years? Yeah, 40 years difference. Parallel jaw gripper, it even has the same defects. 40 years, no change. And this is the state of the art in robot hands in factories. We have not made much progress at all at manipulation. Some of you will come back to it. You remember that? Thank you for this. Remember that OpenAI system? We'll come back to that. Read a book. Every few months, I love Oren, but every few months they're doing a physics test by reading a school book or something. And it's because a lot of human knowledge can be found in books, increasingly in video tech tutorials. So people say, if we just get the AI system to read the books and the videos, then they will learn everything, that all the data will be there. But most of what we talk about for reading books doesn't work as well as we think. And this is some examples. The Winograd scheme is from NYU. Many of you probably know this, but we read that sentence. Alice tried frantically to stop her daughter from chatting at the party, leaving us to wonder why she was behaving so strangely. Who's she? Alice. What if from barking at the party? Who's she? It's her daughter is behaving strangely. And most of the neural net parsing of language doesn't get that. The delivery truck zoomed by the school bus because it was going so fast. Who was going fast? Yeah, the truck, if it was going so slow, it now refers to the school bus. Sam pulled up a chair to the piano, but it was broken, so he had to stand instead. The chair was broken, but if he sings, then the piano was broken. Language is much more subtle. And, we assume, the writers assume that we know a lot of stuff. We know that Prince William is, because I do come from the colonies, so I talk about Prince William. Prince William is taller than his son, Prince George, but we also know that we don't know whether that will be true in 20 years or not. We just understand a lot of stuff instantaneously. Cars can generally go faster than pedestrians unless the traffic is stopped, et cetera, et cetera. So reading books requires all this background knowledge, which our current systems just don't have. Because our current systems have common sense. And John McCarthy started working on it in 1958. That was the first paper about common sense in 58. And recently, DARPA announced a $2 billion research program in AI with the first $200 million to common sense. I think this is a great thing that they're looking at that. And what I really love about it, well, they talk about different domains, objects, agents, places, et cetera. What I really love about it is these diagrams with these months. And you look at that and you think it's a PERT chart, but it's not a PERT chart. Underneath it are the references. This is about children months. They're all about what children can do at those months. They're not claiming they're going to do this stuff that quickly, but it is based on understanding what children are able to do and when. Well, that's maybe I got back to being a grumpy old man. Everything's almost impossible. What could we work on today? What could you work on today that is going to make the world a better place? And I've used this example for a few years. I'm not going to apologize for having used it for a few years. I think it's okay to say the same thing for 10 years. After that, I have to say new stuff. And here's what I think. If you can make progress on the object recognition capabilities of a 2-year-old, or you can make progress on the language understanding of a 4-year-old, or the manual dexterity of a 6-year-old, or the social understanding of an 8-year-old. If you can make those things better, we will have better AI systems that can do more in our worlds. So 2-year-old object recognition, 2-year-olds have color constancy. It's great. It helps you understand stuff from the color, even if the lighting conditions change. 2-year-olds can map form to function. A 2-year-old will happily come and sit here. It's a bit hard for me with the length of my legs, but this thing is a chair. This step here can be a chair. Form, function from form. Form from function? Yeah. Map from form to function from visual clues. They have object classes and can categorize objects that look totally new at the pixel level. And they can do one-shot learning. You can show a kid a picture of a giraffe, and they can generalize from that cartoon to a real giraffe, all sorts of things. Even 1-3 shots, not millions of shots or repeated shots. A 4-year-old can talk and listen, and we have had some progress in the last few years here. Alexa, far-field speech, fantastically better. Deep learning made that work. So we can talk and we'll listen much better than we could. A 4-year-old can do that. But a 4-year-old also knows about turn-taking and understanding cues if they're calm. If they're not calm, all bets are off. They know when they're in conversation with someone and when participants change. If someone else comes into the conversation, they're aware of that. They can interact with multiple participants and know how to get the attention of a particular participant. They can tune in or out other conversations and know when someone is speaking differently than normal, when they're ill or when they have a cough or whatever. And they understand complex sentences and apply common sense to tense and hypotheticals. Our current systems don't do that. 6-year-old can reliably estimate from vision how to pick up many objects, one-handed, two-handed, wrapping arms, etc. Pre-shape their hands for grasps. Ken's got a company which is doing this, so we're making progress on this. But a 6-year-old can apply and control force appropriate for a task. They can use tools. They can operate and close many containers, etc. Pick up cats and small dogs. And getting back to the elder care, they can even wipe their own bum, which is fairly reliably. And that's important for our elder care robot. An 8-year-old can articulate their own beliefs, desires, and intentions. Our current neural net systems have no idea about their beliefs or desires, so they can't articulate them. They understand that other people can have different beliefs, desires, etc. A bunch of things here that they can understand. So if you could make progress on any of these things, we would have better robots, better AI systems. They'd be more useful. And you can get tenure. Oops. Now let's go to the more difficult case. This is part 2 of the talk. How am I doing on time? Yeah, it's short. We, like to think of us humans building robots that are equivalent to us, okay? And we sort of think, yeah, we're smart enough to do that. We're humans, after all. We can do that. Now, what if you saw this scene? Well, you're on vacation, it's good, but you see this scene, 2 dolphins, A and B. Okay, that's interesting. Then what if you looked at B closer? Ooh, it's a robot dolphin. Would you think A had built B? You think dolphins are smart enough to build robot dolphins? Maybe they're smart enough to think about philosophy, about whether it's possible. We don't know their language. But we don't jump to the we wouldn't jump to the conclusion a dolphin was smart enough to build an artificial dolphin. But somehow we think we're smart enough to build general intelligence or superintelligence. Maybe we're not smart enough. Maybe there's a dolphin threshold sort of for us. We can only build, we can't even build a squirrel, maybe we can never get there. Maybe we are stuck. Maybe we're just stuck. We're probably, this is bad news for all of you, you're probably not going to escape this galaxy in your lifetime. Actually, you're probably not going to escape the solar system in your lifetime. Actually, you're probably not going to get off Earth in this lifetime. There are limitations which we live with, but we think, oh yeah, we can build superintelligence. That's no problem. Okay, well, suppose we are smart enough. Then the question is, are we going about it the right way? And I sort of think that maybe computation and Moore's law have delivered higher grade methodological cocaine to researchers and got them, yeah, we can, a few years ago, remember Brooks' PhD thesis? 3 images. Mine was 5 billion images. I'm smarter. You may be, you probably are, but I think that the computation had a lot to do with that, the amount of computation you had. So maybe that's why we're making progress and we're not really being smart. It's mostly computation. Or maybe we're not even wrong. And this is what Schrodinger used to say about people with goofy physics ideas. He's not even wrong. It's so bad, he's not even wrong. Maybe we're not even wrong. Computation, this is what, where did computation come from? Computation came from wanting to compute astronomical events, and you needed tables to do that. John Napier in 1615 published, after 20 years of manual work, published 10,800 7-digit numbers. They were natural logarithms and logarithms of trigonometric functions. He made a mistake 20 years early, so there was a bit of an accuracy problem at the end. 1615 though, big table, first commercial table. Johann Kepler used them in 1619 to compute his 1620 ephemeris over where, which was part navigational and part astrological. They were sort of mixed together back then, but he predicted what would happen from Kepler's logarithms. And so then became an industry of having people do computation. Before this time, they just used pencil and paper, but this is with adding machines. And they were producing tables. There were lots of inaccuracies, especially going to typesetting. So Babbage came up with the idea of having a machine which could directly typeset the output of tables, and using Taylor's theorem and truncated polynomials that could be done by differences. His difference engine could do it. Then he went to the analytic engine as a more powerful thing. If you haven't read Ada Lovelace's translation about the analytical engine and her long notes, I recommend it. If you go to my website at MIT, you can download it. It's just a beautiful piece of work. And then Turing came along. Turing, 1936. On computable numbers, oh, there's that other phrase there. Us computer scientists forget the other phrase. Whereas he defined what computation was, right? And he said that computable numbers are those whose decimals are calculable by finite means. For the present, I'll only say that the justification lies in the fact that human memory is necessarily limited. Just a minute. This is about what we do, computation. What's that got to do with human memory? We may compare a man in the process of computing a real number. Where's the man? Oh, there he is. There's the man. Okay. And And then he sort of says, this is what computation is. And he defines, if you go back to here, he defines the Turing machine right here. And that's but it's modeled after a person working with paper and pencil on computing digits of numbers. And he's trying to say that this is what computation is. And he says all arguments which can be given are bound to be all arguments which can be given are bound to be fundamentally appeals to intuition, and for this reason rather unsatisfactory mathematically. So he sort of knows he's on shaky ground about saying this. But why is he doing it? Well, because in 1928, David Hilbert, famous guy, Hilbert problems, 1900, came up with 3 more problems about mathematics. Is it complete, consistent, decidable? 1928, he published a book in German about this. This is actually the translation of the second edition. I'll get back to that in a second. And Max Newman, who was teaching undergraduates at Cambridge, had Turing in his class and said, is there a mechanical process for decidability? And that's what Turing was doing with his paper. He was trying to show, and he went for the cheap shot. The cheap shot was to show, because Gödel had already showed that, unlike what Hilbert thought, mathematics was neither complete or consistent. Turing said, I'm going to show it's not decidable. But so he had to define what you could do with a mechanical process and show that wasn't enough to decide mathematics. So he had to come up with a definition of what you could do mechanically, show that was all there could be, and say, see, I told you, Hilbert, it's not good enough. Later, he tried to do the same thing for the Riemann hypothesis. So he was interested not in defining computation, he was interested in proving Hilbert wrong, because that's a big score. And he needed to have something which was good enough that no one could argue with, that you could do more with the machine. And in the second edition in 1938, after his 1936 paper, Hilbert only says, this guy Church came up with it. He doesn't mention Turing. So Turing didn't get a shot. And Turing had to not know that he was going to be much more famous than Hilbert. That's what he succeeded in doing. By the way, Hilbert and Church thought about decidability and mathematics as rewriting formulas, not as putting numbers in places and symbols and coming back to them. And I think that's probably why Hilbert referred only to Church's result, because it fit more with his idea. The editor of this second edition of the translation says, by the way, Hilbert was really sloppy about his rewriting rules. It's mess everywhere. So they weren't as mechanistic as Turing was. But that's what Turing was trying to do. Minsky's beautiful book, Computation, Finite and Infinite Machines, is trying to say, well, what's a computer? We study the kinds of machines that can be built out of a finite number of simple parts and that can be physically realized. And then later in the book, he says, well, you may not agree with me about what computation is. You may have a strong disagreement, either intellectually or more likely, emotionally, but the rest of the stuff's beautiful, and it is beautiful. This is what foundations of theory of computation, one of the foundational books. It's great, but it's within this framework. It's within the framework of what you can do with these machines that change state. And Knuth in '68, he's dancing around and says, yeah, it's what a person can do with a pencil and paper. That's what computation is. And Hopcroft and Ullman, '69, sort of say, well, the procedure is what a computer can do. And they sort of get a bit round in a loop. And they talk about Turing and some complexity arguments. But there was never any real, this is computation. It was a social construction of what computation is. You hit a drum, it's solving Bessel, it's finding zeros of Bessel functions instantaneously. It's not producing digits, more digits by doing things longer. So it's different than this sort of stuff, but it's a different physical sort of stuff. Computation. So Peter, you're an entrepreneur. You're building companies. So let's this is Peter Abel, let's try a different world. Suppose that SpaceX didn't exist and that you had decided that putting up 4,000 or 10,000 satellites to provide internet service to everyone could make you extraordinarily wealthy. And you said, that's the company I'm going to start. What sort of stuff would you have to work on? SpaceX doesn't exist. You need cheap launch.
Rocket engines?
Rocket engines, yeah?
Precision tracking?
Precision tracking? Control, yeah. Satellite communication? Yeah, I agree. Notice he didn't say, I'd write a program. He did not say that. But, you know, we've got these two big problems that has defined humankind. Where do we come from? What makes us us? These are the two questions that religion tries to answer. And in the middle of the 20th century, we started to get a handle on thinking about these from the point of view of science and engineering. These two big questions. Where do we come from? What makes us us? I'm gonna tie it back to you in a second, Peter. So, origins of life. In the 50s, we started putting flasks of carbon and other things and making electric discharges and making organic molecules. Artificial life, the first paper on artificial life was by John von Neumann, 1948, with a 29-state cellular automata that could self-reproduce and had a tape inside it that was both interpreted and copied and became the central dogma of biology for many years before DNA was discovered. And only recently we figured out there's a lot more going on there. That was von Neumann. In science, neuroscience, trying to understand what makes us us, and the engineering is artificial intelligence. And for some reason, unlike Peter, 3 of those 4 boxes have got filled with computation. We think computation's the answer. How do you build an AI system? Oh, you start writing a Python program. I mean, apart from the fact that it's Python, but start writing a Python program. Why do we? Sorry?
I thought it was Lisp. Why have you changed?
No, I'm making fun of the modern generation. I'll show you. These days.
For some self-deprecation.
My most recent program has been in Python. I admit it. And the one before that, JavaScript. Okay. But somehow, Peter didn't make the mistake. I'm going to write a program. That's how I'm going to get things into orbit. He knew he had to do other stuff. But we think, for some reason, that computation is it. I don't know how we, computation is based on a model of people doing arithmetic with pencil and paper. Are we just so lucky that that came along right at the time we started to ask these questions, and that's the stuff you need to build intelligence or to build how life evolves? Is that the stuff? I sort of doubt it. Barbara Tversky at Stanford talks about how our mind. So now, I got to change the context here. I'm not going to talk about building an AI system like a human right now. Right now, I'm going to talk about how limited humans are. So Tversky talks about how the way we think is based on how we move through the world. She's got 9 laws of cognition. First one is there are no benefits without costs, and this basically says, you got to take a shortcut to get anything, but it's going to cost you somewhere else in your cognitive architecture. But then action molds perception. The mind can override perception. We saw that with the strawberries. The mind was overriding the raw color values we got in, seeing red strawberries when there was no red there. And she says that spatial thinking is foundation of abstract thought. And George Lakoff here at Berkeley has talked about this from a philosophical point of view for a long time, that our thoughts and language are built on top of metaphors about how we experience the physical world. And the most basic concepts come from up. So when we talk about, my performance is up, the stock market is up, because up is something we sense with gravity. There's all sorts of stuff here. I'm running out of time, but we talk about things as containers. So here's a bunch of sentences about a race, and where, are you in the race on Sunday? Did you see the race? There was a lot of good running in the race. And we use metaphors for physical places to understand the world. By the way, here's verbs used for hand motion in English, and you can see how most of those are used as metaphors. I can grasp that problem. I really had to push hard on it. And look at all, side thing, look at all those things about manipulation. Remember OpenAI? There's a long way to go. It was big, for those of you who don't know, OpenAI had 200 years of simulated reinforcement learning, moving an object around in an upturned hand, not even a hand like this, and the press went wild. They have figured out manipulation. That was an aside. So the mind is inherently embodied. Thought is mostly unconscious. Abstract concepts are largely metaphorical, and that's what we try to use to understand. That's our brains. They're really limited, and we try to understand intelligence without limitations. We think in terms of places, containers, and that's exactly what Turing did with his model of computation. Places and containers, you put something there, you get it later. It's good enough for Turing computation, works for Newtonian physics, it doesn't work for quantum physics. We know that it fails. Maybe it fails for understanding the human brain. Is it good enough for building intelligence? By the way, even our model of computation isn't how real computation works. There's layers of abstraction, which is why we have the Spectre meltdown, etc. Memory is smeared all over the place in time and space. There are no places for it. It's all a metaphor. So is computation sufficient to model what interests us? And I sort of think not. I have run out of time. I'll just show this one little experiment. I'll only show one. This is a polyclad flatworm. If you've ever been diving, you've seen them on coral reefs. They're very simple creatures. They have 2,000 neurons. They've got a mouth. They've got these little ruffles. They wander along. They feed. They push stuff into their feeding hole. 2,000 neurons. And they've got these sort of transverse things down there. And you see the 4 of them coming down to the tail. And that's the brain, 2,000 neurons. And in the 50s, people were trying to see if a creature could learn something, and you do a brain transplant, and the new creature has the memories of the old one. And I think they never say it in the papers, but I think a grad student made a mistake because there's suddenly a bunch of papers about what happens when you put the brain in backwards or flipped over or sideways. And there's a whole series of papers on this with no motivation. And with those 4 things there, you can put it this way, you can put it that way, you can put it that way, you can put it that way. If you put it sideways, nothing ever happens. It just doesn't work because they don't connect. But if you put them that way, there's all, they get better. They adapt over time, over a period of days. Sometimes they start walking backwards, but then they learn to walk forwards. Some of them can feed, some of them can't feed. You can figure it out, by doing the experiments. And there, I just don't think computation is a good way of thinking about that. It's development is the way of thinking about it. It's a different sort of metaphor. I've run out of time, so I'm going to skip where neurons came from. But maybe getting even to that level, we need a whole new way of thinking, which is not computational. Computation may not be enough to get us into orbit, may not be enough to understand intelligence or to understand the development of life. So if you're really smart, you're really dedicated, and you don't care about tenure, go solve this. You'll be more famous than Hilbert or Turing, but it's a risk. Thank you.
All right, we have time for questions. This is our magical box that I'm going to throw to you, and you use it like this to ask a question. And then you may or may not, you can toss it to someone else for the next question. I'll help guide that, but I'll open it up for questions.
No one, great.
I don't believe that.
There's someone back there on the left.
Oh, yeah, oh.
Okay. Yeah, you presented some negative examples, or at least examples that you thought were overhyped in the media about modern intelligence. I was curious if you had any recent work that you thought was maybe in the spirit of some of the things you're suggesting, or other
Sorry,
work that...
can you say it again?
Is there other work that you might suggest as like... So you listed work like OpenAI's Dexterity that you gave as maybe a negative example or an example that you at least thought was overhyped in intelligence. I was curious if you had papers that were recently published that you did recommend, or that you thought this strikes me as like kind of being in the right direction for a long-term path that might work out.
Yeah, I can't pronounce her last name. Katerina Fridisky. Does anyone can you pronounce it? Sorry. Yes, her at CMU. She talks about learning how the current data sets don't give you, current data sets are all, of images are all face on and give you good views, but in reality you see a lot of things sideways and little narrow things, and how can we get better views of those? And she uses, gets little bits of model and computes from that and does sort of in a simulated world to try to figure that stuff out. So I think going from, where the work is trying to go from these sort of curated data sets, which are very artificial, to data sets which are much more natural in the world, is good. And I'm about to shock some people here. Maybe some simulation work there is good for that. Change every 10 years. You have to change every 10 years. Anita's coughing down here. Anita did a PhD with me many years ago. Oh no, just a couple of years ago.
There's a question here.
Oh, so you mentioned our way of thinking is very embodied, but as we expand our capabilities and moving in the physical world, does that mean we expand our way of thinking? Let's say if we extend we can go to space and
Probably not. I don't think it's going to expand. I think what we have to do is figure out how to think more abstractly and not necessarily try to understand everything in terms of physical metaphors. And I think that's been a big mistake or a big problem for why people have trouble understanding quantum mechanics. They keep wanting to put it into physical metaphors instead of just going with the mathematics. If you're a mathematician, you do, universal algebra. You just got to deal with the symbolic systems. So it requires a different way of thinking about the world, a more abstract way. That's how we'll make progress. Yeah, it's fun to go to space, but I don't think it's going to help us.
Can I ask another question? Do you define intelligence as understanding of the world? So so basically, the superintelligent would be having a complete understanding of the.
Well, the way people who are advocates of superintelligence describe it is it's going to be more intelligent than a human, and the human will never be able to fool it, and will never be able to trick it into letting you switch it off because it'll be so smart, it'll outsmart you at every take. So most of these are done in terms of comparison to human intelligence. Of course, it's not a single scale; it's a much more complex thing than that. So, which is why I was suggesting fairly complex tasks in the world as a metric, but there's all edge cases. Yes.
We're over here.
So I'd really like to hear you say a few more words about what you take to be the distinction between computation and what you put as development. Of course, you can simulate aspects of a system developing with a digital computer. So I'm wondering if you think it's something more about the material, a different kind of, a different model of computation, maybe something more like mixed analog digital, or what exactly you have in mind?
Yeah, I did have more, but I ran out of time. Computers are undeniably useful for simulating the rocket engines and simulating everything that Peter wants to build for his new space company. Computers are undeniably useful for that. But they're running with a different complexity level, and they may not lead to understanding if you try to understand as computational. So I was going to put a little book by Stuart Kaufman at the end. Stuart Kaufman from the Santa Fe Institute. It's a small book. First 2 chapters are great. Next 6 chapters, not so great. Because the first 2 chapters really try to lay out the problem of the way biological systems often construct their own environment for themselves. And he refers to some mathematical papers. I don't think it's anywhere near done, but that's the sort of thing about how systems self-construct their own environments. And it wasn't until I read that I came to understand why it was that all these people with Nobel Prizes in immunology thought they had deep insight into AI. And none of them succeeded, but there were a whole bunch of them, 3 of them, who kept saying, I'm going to solve AI. And it was, I think, because they saw how the immunological system, which is a very fast learning system, builds its own structure as it goes and then makes it better at it. And I'm guessing that's why they thought they saw an insight into AI that the rest of us weren't seeing. So something around that. If I knew it, I would have done it. But so I'm just shooting in the dark. But I'm pretty sure we need something new. I doubt that our current model of computation will hold up for the next 250 years as being the answer. Yes?
So I was just wondering if you think that reaching AGI by sort of these more like abstract methods is probably a lot further in the future than a lot of other people currently think. Another approach to getting to AGI is to, if we could perfectly like slice up a brain and be able to like represent everything inside of it in a simulation, even if we don't explicitly understand all of those processes. Do you think that that is also further away than people would think, or like how does that compare?
Yeah, I think the latter, the slicing up the brain, and I think that's further away than Ray Kurzweil would like to think it is. And part of that is because we still don't understand some fundamental issues about the brain. We didn't, just, I don't know, when it was 10, 15 years ago, we didn't know that small molecules, nitrous oxide, were important in their diffusion. And none of the structure of the brain talks about them at all. We don't know about all sorts of things that are on the neurons, and we don't know, it's only recently, it's sort of like junk DNA. Well, that's just junk. Oh, those glial cells, they don't do anything. Well, it turns out the glial cells do some stuff. Even C. elegans has 20 glial cells. They're there for a reason. And we don't understand those reasons. So right now, any hope of scanning, cutting, when we don't understand how it works, isn't gonna, we don't, you said, can we do it when we don't understand how it works? We better understand everything that's important to how it works, and we don't have a clue.
Hi, you started by talking about the media and its coverage of like AI and robotics. I'm not necessarily old enough to know how this has been over like the entire period of what you spoke about, but there seems to be like an existential distrust in these systems at large amongst people that don't at all understand them or sort of take what is written at face value. Do you think the current trajectory of the media is sustainable with this? Do you think it affects how we sort of approach this at all? Do you think it matters at all?
I think I am older than you, and I've seen it happen a whole bunch of times. It happened in the 60s, and I was only a kid watching it then, but you can just see some outrageous things. Some of them coming out of MIT, other places, about how close we were to human level intelligence and how it was coming, and then the press talking about what it will be like in 5 years, getting it completely wrong. The Lighthouse Report was a reaction to that in the UK in 1973, and it just completely crashed funding around the world for AI in the mid-70s, which is when I entered AI. And then we had a similar sort of thing about neural networks. You heard of them? In the 80s, they were going to do everything any day now. We had expert systems going to do everything any day now. Crashed. In the early 90s, I was told when I went to DARPA not to mention the word robot, because robot was a bad word. I was able to talk about programmable machines, but not robots, because they got such bad press when they didn't deliver on what was promised. So we do see that cycle. And I've been saying for the last few years very explicitly what we're not going to have, because I'm just getting ready for the press to come at me. You said we would have such and such. And I want to no, look, I said you won't. I said you won't. So it's self-preservation. And I recommend it to all of you. I know Mike has been saying some things which, and often when I tweet about something, I get the Elon fanboys tell me that I don't understand just how powerful AI is. And
it's good to know that the superintelligence of 2400 will understand this conversation as it's archived and comment on it.
Hello,
we are good. Please be good to us. So with that, let's thank Rodney Brooks for a great talk.
Thank you.
Thank you. He has a very short amount of time. If you want to interact with him, I will have to steal him away shortly. But please, if you wanted to come up, you're more than welcome. I'm sure he'd like to talk to you. See you next week.